Ukraine might recover Crimea. It is not as unlikely as it may seem. Last week marked 1 year since Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. To that end, both the Americans for Ukraine organization and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation organized deeply moving and insightful events in Washington, D.C., to commemorate that anniversary. This month also marks the 9th anniversary of Putin's invasion of Crimea, another watershed moment in the tense relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Now, though, the possibility of Ukraine retaking Crimea, which was unfathomable just a few weeks ago, has been given some credibility. Could that even work? Lay the groundwork. I usually don't like Politico magazine for its leftist bias, but even a blind squirrel finds an acorn every once in a while. And I came across your February 22, 2023 article. This is how Ukraine could take back Crimea, written by Casey Michel, quite thoughtful and helpful. Among the key points raised by Mr. Michel's article are that Ukrainian territorial recaptures in areas like Kherson have begun to change American experts' minds about the prospect, but also that Ukraine will first have to release major holdings in places like Zaporizhia and Donetsk before seriously considering an assault on the Crimea. Michel also cites the experience of retired Australian Defence Force Major General Mick Ryan, who envisions the possibility of a large-scale air, sea, and land operation to advance on several axes against key ground targets in the Crimea, forming a robust air and sea campaign to accompany the nearly 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers needed to capture Crimea. In other words, a combined arms offensive. That would include sending in the elite air assault forces as the shock soldiers and using aircraft like the MiG-29 Fulcrum fighter and Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunship as cover. Air and close air support, CAS, to Ukrainian ground troops. But additional weaponry is still needed to make a Ukrainian victory in Crimea worthwhile. According to Alexandra Brzozowski, Global Europe and Defense Editor at EURACTIV, US-made ATACMS missiles, which have a range of about 297 kilometers, 184.5 miles, but that the Biden administration has so far refused to provide to Ukraine. Never mind that other key US allies such as South Korea, Poland, Greece, Romania, Turkey, Qatar, and Bahrain already have them. Crunching the numbers, Ukrainian versus Russian labor. As for the projection of the 100,000 troops needed for Ukraine to have a realistic chance of retaking Crimea, this seems like an overly ambitious goal at first glance. But, as my friend and former colleague PJC DeVay wrote, Reserve Distinction, a retired South African infantry officer who is an expert in military history, tactics, and strategy, points out, there is something else lurking beneath the surface of that seemingly daunting numerical disparity on paper between the Ukrainian and Russian armed forces. As John, as his friends call him, points out in an essay titled, Opinion, the real numbers on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Over 360,000 Russian forces, including 280,000 Army, 45,000 airborne, and 35,000 Marines, were present in Ukraine at the outbreak of hostilities. In addition, there were some 1,000 Special Forces troops. On the other hand, Ukraine began the conflict with some 251,000 soldiers, of whom 225,000 were from the Army, 20,000 from the Airborne, and 6,000 from the Marine Corps, in addition to 1,000 troops from the Forces Specials. However, the number of paramilitary personnel Ukraine can deploy is much higher, with some 102,000 available for defensive purposes. An estimated 354,000 Ukrainians are now actively participating in the conflict. Although the Ukrainian army has fewer soldiers, more paramilitary personnel are able to be deployed for defense. Conversely, the Russian military may not be as effective in defensive operations due to a lack of available troops and a smaller force size in Ukraine to emphasize. In light of the fact that, in the event of a hypothetical liberation mission to Ukraine, the Russians would be on the defense in Crimea, a dramatic reversal from March 2014. The last statement is particularly important. More figures, the Russian body count. Another numerical factor to consider in connection with the manpower statistics cited by John is Russian attrition, that is, human casualties and material losses. The headline of an article in today's edition of the Washington Times, written by Mike Glenn, puts it bluntly, Russia's losses in Ukraine exceed all its wars since World War II, study finds. Regarding material losses, to cite just a few examples, courtesy of my 1945 colleague Stavros Atlamazoglu, 299 combat, attack, bombing, and transport aircraft, 287 attack and transport helicopters, 3,350 tanks, 2,352 artillery pieces, 6,593 armored personnel carriers, and infantry fighting vehicles. Indeed, the report does not delve into how many of these Russian casualties and equipment losses occurred specifically in Crimea. But nonetheless, when everything in this article is taken into account, a Ukrainian liberation of Crimea does not seem so implausible afterward of everything. Thanks for watching.